Turn your Bibles to Daniel, the 8th chapter, and this evening we will read verses 1 through 4 as an introduction to our lecture. We finished the prophecy of the four beasts from the 7th chapter, and now we're in the 8th chapter where we run into the prophecy of the ram and the male goat. This is part 1. The text we are going to be reading doesn't cover everything that we're going to talk about tonight, but it is the beginning of the prophecy and just gets us in the door. So starting at Daniel chapter 8, verse 1, in the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after the one that appeared to me the first time. I saw in the vision, and so it happened while I was looking, that I was in Shushan, the citadel, which is in the province of Elam, and I saw in the vision that I was by the river Ulai. Then I lifted my eyes and saw, and there, standing beside the river, was a ram which had 2 horns, and the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. I saw the ram pushing westward, northward, and southward, so that no animal could withstand him, nor was there any that could deliver from his hand, but he did according to his will and became great. So Daniel sees this ram. If we would go on, you would see that he then sees the male goat, and there's a contest between the two. The prophecy of the ram and the male goat is the second prophecy given to Daniel. Daniel refers to this vision as after the one that appeared to me the first time, and the first time being the prophecy of the 4 beasts in chapter 7. This prophecy was given to him in the 3rd year of Belshazzar, which was 551 BC. The prophecy was given to Daniel in the form of a vision. As with the previous vision, the characters are depicted by animals, horns, and another little horn. If you would read into the 8th chapter, you see there's another little horn that appears. The prophecy features 2 animals identified as a ram and a male goat, or if you're reading out of the King James Version, it calls it a he-goat. The ram symbolizes the Medo-Persian Empire, and this is made perfectly clear in verse 20, which says, the ram which you saw having the 2 horns, they are the kings of Media and Persia. Ram is the Hebrew word, and excuse my pronunciation, ayil, meaning strength, and is used to denote various things that are strong, such as a ram, a strong man, and strong trees. This word appears 185 times in the Old Testament. 156 of the times it is translated ram. 21 times it's translated post, like a fence post. 4 times it's translated mighty men. 2 times it's translated trees, and it is translated 1 time each lintel and oaks. The ram was the symbol used by the Persians, such as the eagle is the symbol used by the United States of America. The male goat symbolizes the Greek Empire, as is made plain to us in verse 21, where it says, and the male goat is the kingdom of Greece. The large horn that is between its eyes is the first king. The expression male goat, or he-goat as it is in the King James, is really 2 Hebrew words. Again, excuse my pronunciation, but "ais" meaning a goat, and particularly a female goat, but it denotes the strength of the goat more than the gender of the goat. And then the second word is saphir, meaning a male goat. So when you put the two words together, it indicates a very strong goat. Certainly the ram was strong, but this male goat apparently is much stronger. Adam Clarke comments on this male goat. He writes, "A goat was a very proper symbol of the Grecian or the Macedonian people. 200 years before the time of Daniel, they were called Aegiadae, the goat's people." That's what that word means, Aegiadae. Caranus, their first king, going with a multitude of Greeks to seek a new habitation in Macedonia, was advised by an oracle to take the goats for his guides. And afterwards, seeing a herd of goats flying from a violent storm, he followed them to Edessa, and there fixed the seat of his empire, and made the goats his ensigns or standards, and called the place Aegae, or Aegea. You ever heard of the Aegean Sea? Aegea means the goat's town, and the people, Aegiadae, the goat's people. Now, it's interesting that later in history, Alexander the Great named his son Alexander Aegeus, which means Alexander the goat. That might impress you as being a slur, but it was a compliment to be called a goat among the Greeks. It was assumed in our previous studies on Nebuchadnezzar's dream and the prophecy of the four beasts, based on our knowledge of history, that the succession of the kingdoms forward from Daniel's time would be Babylon to Medo-Persia to Greece to Rome. In this prophecy, the two kingdoms in the middle of this succession are identified in plain language. This fact alone confirms the assumptions made concerning the succession of the empires in the previous prophecies. It also confirms to us the foreknowledge of God, that God actually does know what the future is and will be. In verse 2 of chapter 8, Daniel writes that he saw a vision, and in this vision he saw himself in Shushan, which was the capital city of Persia. Now, I find it strange that Adam Clarke comments on this statement. He writes, Daniel was at this time in Shushan, which appears to have been a strong place where the kings of Persia had their summer residence. Now, this prophecy came to Daniel in 551 BC, the third year of Belshazzar's reign. We know that Babylon fell to Persia in 539 BC. And we know from the 5th chapter of Daniel that Daniel was present at the fall of Babylon. And you will recall that Daniel translated the writing on the wall. And when he did that, Belshazzar promoted Daniel to third ruler in the kingdom on the very night Darius the Mede overthrew the city. So there is no way Daniel could have been in Persia when he received this vision. He only saw himself in Shushan in the vision. And the fact that he saw himself in Shushan in the vision suggests that he would someday be there to experience some of what this prophecy reveals. And we know from the book of Daniel that eventually he was in Shushan, but not when he got this vision. It is interesting to us to learn from this prophecy that another little horn would grow up. In the prophecy of the four beasts, the little horn mentioned there turned out to be Herod the Great, who rose up to be king of Palestine under the Romans, and whose reign marked the time at which Messiah and his kingdom would come to the world. This little horn is not the same as the one in the previous prophecy, because it is associated with the male goat. the Greek Empire. And he is not the large horn on that goat, and he is not one of the four horns that came up after the large horn was broken off. We are told in verse 9 that this little horn came out of one of the horns and grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. And of course, by this time you understand that the glorious land is the promised land, the land of Palestine. Most of this prophecy has to do with the actions of this little horn against God's people. We are told in this prophecy that Daniel was very much troubled by the vision, and while he was trying to understand what the vision meant, someone having the appearance of a man spoke to the angel Gabriel, telling him to explain the vision to Daniel. So Gabriel tells him in verse 17 that the vision refers to the time of the end. Also in verse 19, Gabriel says, "For at the appointed time the end shall be." Some have construed this to mean the prophecy concerns the end of time, the return of Christ, or the end of the world. However, Gabriel explains the vision in verses 23 to 25, and it becomes apparent that the end of time to which the vision and the prophecy concerns is the end of the time of the little horn, not the end of the world. What Daniel learned from the vision made him sick. We are told in verse 27, "And I, Daniel, fainted and was sick for days. Afterward I arose and went about the king's business. I was astonished by the vision, but no one understood it." The events in the vision were to happen hundreds of years in the future, a time in which Daniel would not even be alive. He saw these events would severely impact the holy people, the Jews in the future, who would be under the rule of this little horn. The shock of what he saw overloaded his nervous system, causing him to faint and be sick for several days. He eventually recovered and went back to work. And he writes that he shared this vision with some others, undoubtedly the elders there in Babylon. And one of those elders could have very well been the prophet Ezekiel. And even though he was a prophet, no one understood the vision that Daniel had. For the rest of his life, this vision and what it meant for the holy people haunted him. Now, some things in this vision have led certain modern prophecy teachers to a wrong conclusion. Particularly, two things in the prophecy of the ram and the male goat were exploited and used to predict the return of Christ and the end of time. The first is the mention of 2,300 days, which is mentioned in verse 14, after which the sanctuary shall be cleansed. And the second thing is Gabriel's statement in verse 17, the vision refers to the time of the end. Tying these two things together, it has been imagined that after 2,300 days, assumed to be prophetic days, the sanctuary, whatever that is, should be cleansed and the end would come. That has actually been taught. In particular, it was taught by the Adventists, or the people we now know as the Seventh-day Adventists. And they rely on the manipulation of this prophecy for what they believe to be the prophetic indication and foundation of their movement. See, they believe that their movement was prophesied long time back, going back to the time of Daniel. The first thing they do is to connect the 2,300 days of Daniel chapter 8 with the 70 weeks in Daniel chapter 9. You see, they believe that the 70 weeks prophecy is really a continuation of this prophecy in the 8th chapter. The 70 weeks prophecy predicts the return of the Jews to Judah, which happened in 457 BC. So in their thinking, 457 BC is the starting date for the 2,300 days. Next, they assume that the 2,300 days is actually 2,300 years. The justification for this is what can be called the day for a year principle. And perhaps you've heard that expression used. This principle, if you will call it that, appears twice in the Old Testament. First in Numbers chapter 14, verse 34, and then in Ezekiel chapter 4, verse 6. Numbers 14:34 says, "According to the number of the days in which you spied out the land, 40 days, for each day you shall bear your guilt 1 year, namely 40 years, and you shall know my rejection." In this passage, God is pronouncing judgment on the Israelites for their refusal to go into the promised land after being released from the Egyptian bondage. You see, spies were sent into the land, and the spies came back with a fantastic report on the wealth and the fertility of the land. But they also had a discouraging report on the fierceness of the inhabitants. And because of that, the Israelites refused to go into the land, and God sentenced them to wander in the Sinai Peninsula for 40 years. 1 year for every day the spies were in the promised land. So while there is a correlation of days to years in this judgment of God, it does not appear to qualify as a prophetic principle. Okay? Then Ezekiel chapter 4, verse 6. Now we do know that Ezekiel was a prophet. He writes, "And when you have completed them, lie again on your right side. Then you shall bear the iniquity of the house of Judah 40 days. I have laid on you a day for each year." Now this passage from Ezekiel was given long after the Israelites were in the promised land. In fact, the kingdom had been long divided, the northern kingdom having been carried away into oblivion, and the southern kingdom was soon to be held captive in Babylon. The prophecy in Ezekiel actually begins in verse 4, where God has Ezekiel to lay on his left side for 390 days, indicating God's judgment on the house of Israel, which was the northern kingdom. And then in verse 6, which we just read, Ezekiel lays on his right side for 40 days the sign of God's judgment on the house of Judah, the southern kingdom. The 390 days that God told Ezekiel to lay on his left side indicates the number of years Israel sinned against God, which is reckoned from the rebellion of Jeroboam and the division of the kingdom. God said, start there. And that was 390 years until the judgment of God fell on the northern kingdom, and they were carried off to oblivion by Assyria. The 40 days for Judah are the years since Josiah's reformation, from which Judah had already backslidden. Remember Josiah, the king, the little king, and the Reformation, the revival that was short-lived among the Jews, and they backslided from that. Now, while all this is interesting, it is not germane to Daniel's prophecy. The point that I'm making is the days Ezekiel laid on his side represented years. And while it can be said the days are prophetic years, this does not constitute a prophetic principle that must be applied to the word days in this prophecy in the book of Daniel, or as a matter of fact, to any other prophecy. When interpreting prophecies, you have to give attention to the context. You just can't reach back for a principle and apply it unless the context indicates it's necessary. You see, context is everything to do with interpreting Scripture, even prophecies. The Hebrew word for day is yom, and the word for days is yamim. However, neither of these words appears in Daniel chapter 8, verse 14. The word that is translated days in our English Bibles is Eber Boker, meaning evenings and mornings. That's what that means. And the reason the words for evenings and mornings is used instead of the word days is because of the continual reference in this chapter to the daily sacrifices in the temple, as seen from verse 11, 12, and 13. And you will recall that in the temple, sacrifice was made in the evening and in the morning. It is also made clear in verse 26 of this chapter, where the prophecy itself is called the vision of the evenings and the mornings. There's that strange sounding word, Eber Boker. So it is plain to see from the context of the prophecy that the 2,300 days have to do with the daily sacrifices and cannot be interpreted to mean 2,300 prophetic years. As mentioned earlier, the Adventists used the prophecy of the 70 weeks to fix the start date for their 2,300 prophetic years. So starting at 457 BC and looking forward 2,300 years takes their reckoning to October 22nd, 1844. In their thinking, this was the date on which the sanctuary was to be cleansed, as stated in verse 14, and for Christ to return, bringing the end, as stated in verse 17. However, there was no sanctuary for Christ to cleanse on that date, and Christ did not return on that date. I'm pretty sure of it. Adventists were waiting, having sold their property and their personal possessions. But on October 22nd, 1844, they were not caught up with Christ. Christ did not return. And the event became known as the Great Disappointment. In response to the disappointment, they changed their doctrine to teach that on that date, Christ actually cleansed the sanctuary in heaven. They had made a little bit of a mistake. Cleanse the sanctuary in heaven. So in Adventist thinking, why did the sanctuary need cleansing? Especially a sanctuary in heaven. Surely they have a reason for thinking such a thing. Well, you see, the Adventists held that the little horn in this prophecy was papal Rome. And they believe this because they identify this little horn with the little horn in chapter 7, whom they believe to be papal Rome. So in their thinking, wherever the little horn appears, it has to be papal Rome. Okay? For the sake of consistency, right? They also believe that the cleansing of the sanctuary refers to the process of the Day of Atonement as recorded in Leviticus 16, where the sins of Israel were ceremonially cleansed by the blood of Christ. To them, the church was symbolic, to them the sanctuary was symbolic of the church. And the church had been desecrated by Roman Catholicism through the sins of the people and by the priest. According to the Adventist belief and understanding, the confessed sins of the people were transferred to the heavenly sanctuary through confession and the celebration of the Mass. So every time a Roman Catholic would go into the confessional booth and confess his or her sins to the priest, and the priest would say, "I forgive you," that sin, in their thinking, was transferred to this sanctuary in heaven. And on October 22nd, 1844, it is supposed that Christ had had enough of this, and he spiritually cleansed this heavenly temple, this heavenly sanctuary. With the supposed cleansing of this supposed temple in heaven, the time of the end came. You know, logically it has to. It's in the prophecy, right? But the end of what time? It certainly wasn't the end of all time. It wasn't the return of Christ. The Adventists believe the prophecy means the end of prophetic time. How convenient. Uriah Smith, a famous Adventist author who was not involved in the Great Disappointment of 1844, comments on this end of time in his book, Thoughts Critical and Practical on the Book of Revelation. I have a second edition copy which was printed in 1875, where he comments on this same expression as it was used in Revelation chapter 10, verses 5 and 6. This end of time, or time no longer. In Revelation, we read, "And the angel which I saw stand upon the sea and upon the earth lifted up his hand to heaven, and sware by him that liveth forever and ever, who created heaven and the things that therein are, and the earth and things that therein are, and the sea and the things which are therein, that there should be time no longer." Okay, he connects Daniel chapter 7, this end of time, a time no longer, with Revelation chapter 10 and the time no longer. He writes, "It must therefore mean prophetic time shall be no more. Not that time should never be used in a prophetic sense, but no prophetic period should extend beyond this message. They should all close here. Arguments on the prophetic periods show that the longest ones do not extend beyond the autumn of 1844. Smith cleverly avoids the folly of 1844 as if it had never happened. In saying the Revelation declares that prophetic time shall be no more, he is actually tying the words of the angel in the 10th chapter of Revelation to the 2,300 days of Daniel, and he comes to the conclusion that no prophetic period can extend beyond 1844. This limits all prophetic projections to the time and the message of the Adventists. In other words, Smith is saying, we Adventists, we've got it right. We understand prophecies. God has ordained our movement. And all you other people out there who are preaching prophecies, you're wrong. We are right. Because no prophetic period goes beyond 1844 in his thinking. So, after all this, we now know what the 2,300 days are not. As we study this prophecy, we will come to the correct understanding. which also happens to be recognized by the vast majority of Bible commentators. So there is a truth to be learned. We don't have to be deceived by the errors of people such as Smith and that particular group. Amen.